I did this to you. You will never survive this.
Mistress thinks wife is dead, reveals her evil deed at her bedside, only to be heard by her. Esteemed viewers, welcome to Luxurious True Life Stories. Please like and subscribe for more captivating luxury true stories. Let's get into the story. Snow rested lightly on the wooden rails of the lakeside house as the sun pushed pale gold through the kitchen windows. Cynthia Jones stood barefoot on warm tiles, stirring coffee slowly, the same way she did every morning. Order calmed her. The soft ticking clock, the scent of cinnamon toast, the quiet water outside, this was a life she built carefully, piece by piece. She liked predictable beauty. It made the world feel safe. David Johnson entered half awake, tie hanging over his shoulder, phone already glowing in his hand. He kissed Cynthia's forehead without really seeing her, then smiled once the coffee touched his lips. He was ambitious, always planning bridges, roads, and promotions in his mind. Cynthia watched him with gentle patience. She loved his drive, even when it pulled him away from the stillness she valued. They ate together at the small round table facing the lake. She spoke about a new home design sketch she wanted to publish. He spoke about a coming project review at work. Their conversations overlapped but never collided, a peaceful rhythm, not perfect, but warm. Neither noticed that this ordinary morning would soon become the last uncomplicated one they would ever share. The engineering firm buzzed louder than usual that afternoon. David adjusted his sleeves outside the conference room, rehearsing calm confidence in his head. Inside, executives gathered around blueprints covering the long glass table. The company had secured a massive coastal highway contract, and the atmosphere carried both excitement and pressure. When the director finally spoke his name, David straightened instinctively. He was promoted to lead structural plan, a role far above his previous responsibilities. With it came longer hours, tighter deadlines, and a new project coordinator assigned to support him. The door opened softly and Nellie Benson stepped in, introducing herself with controlled warmth. Her voice was calm, attentive, and precise. She already understood details others had overlooked, and she spoke in ways that made David feel immediately supported. By the end of the meeting, she had organized his chaotic schedule into a clear timeline and solved the calculation conflict he struggled with earlier. David felt relieved in a way he hadn't expected. For the first time in weeks, his shoulders relaxed. As he left the office that night, he texted Cynthia he would be late. Work had become serious now, while Nellie quietly watched him go, memorizing how easily trust had begun forming. Deadlines tightened like invisible ropes around David's shoulders. The coastal highway project demanded precision, and the board expected flawless execution. He began staying later at the office, studying structural models beneath harsh white lights long after most employees had gone home. Each evening, Nellie Benson remained as well, never complaining, always appearing exactly when he needed clarification or reassurance. She organized reports before he asked. She filtered difficult emails. She corrected minor presentation flaws quietly, letting him appear prepared and confident. David began to rely on her rhythm. When stress rose, her steady voice lowered it. When doubt crept in, she offered solutions. She laughed lightly at his dry jokes, listened closely to his frustrations, and praised his leadership in ways that felt sincere. It was subtle, careful work, nothing improper, nothing obvious, just constant presence. At home, Cynthia noticed his exhaustion but welcomed him gently each night. Dinner stayed warm. The house remained peaceful. Yet David's mind lingered at the office long after he stepped through the door. When Cynthia spoke about her design blog growing in readership, he nodded but barely absorbed the details. Meanwhile, Nellie studied the growing gap between husband and wife, recognizing that emotional space often forms before physical distance ever does. The weeks stretched into a pattern of late evenings. David now arrived home after dark more often than not, shoulders tense, eyes fixed on unfinished calculations only he could see. Cynthia adjusted quietly. She kept dinner warm longer, moved their conversations to shorter moments, and saved stories about her day for when he seemed less tired. She told herself pressure came with success. One night, she showed him a digital layout she had spent days perfecting, a lake house interior concept inspired by their own home. David smiled politely but answered an incoming message before she finished explaining the color balance. The glow from his phone reflected in his eyes while her voice faded. It was not cruelty, just absence, but absence lingered longer than harsh words ever could. At the office, Nellie noticed his frustration building. She suggested reorganizing his weekly schedule, reducing unnecessary meetings, and personally handling communication conflicts. David felt understood there. At home, Cynthia felt patience becoming effort. Neither spoke about it. The silence between them stayed gentle but slowly widened, like a crack forming quietly beneath still ice. Saturday arrived with rare sunlight, and David mentioned a quick stop home to collect documents he had forgotten. Nellie offered to drop off revised files along the way since she lived nearby. The visit sounded harmless, practical even. Cynthia opened the door with warm surprise, welcoming her politely, unaware this moment would shift something delicate inside her home. Nellie observed everything carefully, the framed sketches on the walls, the organized shelves, the calm softness of the space. She complimented Cynthia's design talent with convincing admiration and asked thoughtful questions about her blog. Cynthia relaxed, happy to share something personal with someone from David's demanding world. For a short while, conversation flowed naturally, almost friendly. David watched the two women speak and felt relief that his worlds were blending peacefully. Yet Nellie left with a clearer understanding than either of them realized. She had seen the gentleness in Cynthia's nature and the quiet dependence David had on emotional reassurance. As she stepped outside, she recognized how easily presence could become influence when one person offered comfort and the other offered patience. Work pressure intensified as the project entered review phase. David struggled with a design conflict that required late corrections, and frustration followed him through the day. Nellie noticed his agitation before he spoke. She adjusted his workload again, handled calls, and stayed beside him during calculations, her calm voice steadying his thoughts. During a quiet moment, she commented gently that he carried everything alone. She mentioned how some partners supported ambition while others preferred comfort. Her words sounded harmless, almost sympathetic, yet they lingered in his mind. David didn't defend Cynthia, he simply stayed silent, tired enough to absorb the suggestion without questioning it. That night, Cynthia waited with dinner and soft music playing. David arrived distracted, answering short and distant. When she asked about his stress, he replied he needed more focus at home and fewer interruptions. The statement surprised even him after it left his mouth. Cynthia nodded slowly, hurt but composed. Meanwhile, at her apartment, Nellie closed her laptop knowing doubt had begun growing, quiet, invisible, but firmly planted. Rain pressed softly against the office windows long after sunset. Most employees had left hours earlier, leaving only scattered lights across the floor. David leaned back in his chair, staring at columns of numbers that refused to cooperate. The project had reached a delicate phase, and the pressure felt heavier than expected. Nellie placed a cup of tea beside him without interrupting his thoughts. He exhaled slowly and, for the first time, spoke openly. He admitted he felt trapped between expectations and exhaustion. At home, he said, everything was calm but distant, like he was living beside his life rather than inside it. Nellie listened carefully, asking small questions that encouraged him to continue. She never criticized Cynthia directly. Instead, she let David describe his frustrations in his own words. When he finally left that night, the rain had stopped. David felt lighter, unaware that sharing personal worries had shifted something significant. Nellie watched him go with quiet certainty. Emotional trust had formed, not through sudden attraction, but through repeated comfort offered exactly when he felt weakest. The following days moved quickly, yet David's routine began revolving around one constant, Nellie's presence. She anticipated his needs before he voiced them, adjusted his tone before presentations, and corrected details without seeking credit. He started checking his phone not just for work updates, but for her messages specifically. The habit formed quietly, without announcement. At home, Cynthia noticed the difference in his focus. His responses became shorter, his laughter delayed. When she asked about dinner plans, he replied he might eat out with colleagues. He didn't mention Nellie sitting across from him at a quiet restaurant near the office, discussing project strategies while candlelight reflected softly against the glass. The setting looked professional, yet the air carried something more intimate. David told himself it was harmless, partnership, not betrayal. He believed emotional relief did not equal wrongdoing. Meanwhile, Nellie carefully deepened their conversations beyond blueprints and schedules. She spoke about ambition, loneliness, and the fear of being unseen. She mirrored his concerns until their thoughts seemed aligned. What David called understanding, she recognized as attachment forming, steady, deliberate, and increasingly difficult to reverse. Cynthia woke before sunrise and noticed David's phone glowing faintly on the bedside table. A message preview appeared briefly before the screen dimmed again. She did not open it. Instead, she watched the ceiling, listening to his steady breathing, and felt an unfamiliar unease settle in her chest. It wasn't proof, only a quiet instinct she couldn't ignore. Throughout the day she tried focusing on her design work, adjusting color palettes and uploading new sketches, but her attention kept drifting. She replayed small moments, delayed replies, sudden late meetings, conversations that ended quickly when she entered the room. None were dramatic enough to accuse, yet together they formed a pattern too consistent to dismiss. That evening she visited David's office building under the simple reason of bringing dinner. From the lobby she saw him through the glass conference room walls. He and Nellie leaned over the same documents, speaking softly, smiling at something private. The sight wasn't inappropriate, but it felt personal in a way she couldn't explain. Cynthia left quietly before he noticed, carrying untouched food back into the cooling night. Now certain distance had become something more. The project deadline arrived with urgency, keeping David and Nellie at the office long after midnight. Papers covered the table, and the building's lights dimmed automatically, leaving only their workspace illuminated. Exhaustion blurred his judgment, and relief from finishing calculations made the silence feel heavier than before. For a moment, work no longer filled the space between them. They talked, not about engineering, but about life paths and choices. Nellie spoke softly about never having anyone truly choose her first. David admitted he no longer recognized his marriage the way it once felt. Words lingered, and neither corrected them. The closeness they had been building slowly finally crossed into something undeniable. Hours later, David returned home quietly while Cynthia slept on the couch with a blanket still folded in her hands. The dinner she prepared remained untouched on the table. He paused beside her, guilt rising but unspoken, then turned away without waking her. Upstairs, he stared at the ceiling until morning, knowing something irreversible had begun. Morning carried tension instead of comfort. Cynthia spoke gently, asking if everything at work was all right, but David answered too quickly. Small discussions turned into misunderstandings, not loud, just sharp enough to sting. He insisted he needed space to focus. She agreed outwardly, though confusion weighed heavily inside her. At the office, Nellie reinforced his frustrations carefully. She suggested constant questioning at home could distract him from success. She never demanded, she implied. David began believing his distance was necessary discipline rather than avoidance. The idea felt reasonable when spoken calmly, and he accepted it without noticing how often her opinions guided his decisions. That evening Cynthia prepared a quiet dinner again, hoping conversation would ease the strain. Instead, David criticized minor things, the timing, the noise, the interruptions. His words surprised even him, but he didn't take them back. After he left the room, Cynthia sat alone at the table longer than needed, realizing the warmth in their home was no longer shared equally. Cynthia no longer relied on instinct alone. She checked the phone bill quietly, noticing repeated late-night calls to one number. She did not react immediately. Instead, she waited until David returned home early one evening, determined to speak calmly rather than accuse blindly. Her hands trembled, but her voice stayed steady. She asked directly if there was someone else. David denied it at first, then hesitated. That hesitation answered more than words could. When she mentioned Nellie's name, silence filled the room. The truth no longer hid behind schedules or deadlines. He admitted the connection had grown beyond work, though he called it confusion rather than betrayal. Cynthia felt something inside her close, not loudly, but firmly. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She packed a small suitcase while he watched in stunned disbelief. Before leaving, she said she deserved honesty, not distance disguised as ambition. She stepped into the cold night alone, unaware that far worse than heartbreak was already waiting ahead. Rain began suddenly as Cynthia walked along a nearly empty street, the suitcase rolling unevenly over wet pavement. Streetlights blurred through falling water, and passing cars created long reflections across the road. She moved without direction, focused only on putting distance between herself and the house she no longer recognized as home. Across the intersection, a dark vehicle waited longer than necessary at a green light. The engine idled, headlights steady despite the empty road. As Cynthia stepped off the curb, the car accelerated sharply instead of turning. The impact came without warning, a violent sound swallowed by the storm, and her suitcase slid across the asphalt as she collapsed onto the rain-soaked ground. Sirens arrived minutes later. Paramedics rushed, voices urgent but controlled as they lifted her onto a stretcher. Her eyes remained closed, breathing shallow. One officer glanced around, noticing the vehicle was already gone. In the distance, from inside another parked car, someone watched the ambulance leave before slowly driving away into the rain. The hospital corridors carried the steady rhythm of machines and distant footsteps. David arrived breathless after the call, disbelief still holding him together. A doctor explained the injuries were severe, head trauma, internal damage, and survival was uncertain. The words sounded clinical, yet they hollowed him instantly. He stood outside the intensive care room, unable to step closer. Hours passed before he finally entered. Cynthia lay motionless beneath soft white light, her face pale against the sheets. Tubes and monitors surrounded her, translating fragile life into blinking numbers. David whispered her name, but nothing changed. Guilt pressed heavily now, sharper than fear. He remained beside her bed, realizing silence could feel louder than any argument they ever had. Later that evening, Nellie arrived carrying concern shaped carefully into her expression. The doctor spoke again, explaining Cynthia had not regained consciousness and neurological response was minimal. Nellie absorbed the information with calm acceptance while David struggled to process it. As he stepped out to sign paperwork, she remained behind, standing beside the bed longer than sympathy alone required. The room was dim except for the soft glow of monitors. Rain tapped lightly against the hospital window, almost gentle compared to the storm that had changed everything. Nellie closed the door quietly after confirming David had gone to speak with the physician. She stepped closer to the bed, studying Cynthia's still face with an expression no longer masked by concern. "You were always too calm," she whispered, her tone steady, almost conversational. "Too trusting." She adjusted the blanket as if performing kindness. Then her voice lowered. She admitted she had followed Cynthia that night. She had arranged the timing, the waiting car, the empty intersection. She said it wasn't personal at first, just necessary. David needed freedom. Success required sacrifice. And Cynthia had been standing in the way. As she leaned closer, satisfied that unconscious ears could not hear, a faint movement passed across Cynthia's fingers. Her breathing remained controlled, but awareness flickered behind closed eyes. Every word reached her clearly. Nellie smiled softly, believing silence meant safety. She had no idea the woman she believed defeated was now listening to every confession. Morning light replaced the dim night glow, but Cynthia kept her eyes closed. Every sound sharpened, footsteps in the hallway, nurses adjusting equipment, the steady pulse of machines. She understood now what had happened and why. Fear rose briefly, yet she forced stillness. If Nellie believed she could hear, she would never speak again. When David visited, he spoke softly beside her bed, apologizing for things she could not answer. His voice carried regret she had never heard before. Cynthia wanted to react, but restraint mattered more than comfort. She let silence remain while memorizing every word, every pattern of who came and went. Later, Nellie returned, unaware anything had changed. She spoke casually about the future, about how life would settle once everything was finalized. Cynthia listened carefully, focusing on each sentence. She could not move yet, but she understood patience would now protect her more than immediate truth ever could. By the third day, Cynthia had learned the rhythm of the ward. Nurses rotated every few hours, lights dimmed at predictable times, and visitors were rarely questioned if they appeared confident. She remained motionless whenever anyone looked directly at her, but once alone she slowly practiced moving a finger, then her wrist, careful not to disturb the monitors. Recovery became deliberate, not visible. A sympathetic night nurse named Laura noticed the faint movements and quietly understood more than she said. Instead of alerting the others immediately, she listened as Cynthia whispered broken fragments of the truth late that evening. Laura did not react loudly. She simply adjusted the bedside equipment so the recording feature remained active whenever visitors approached. When Nellie returned again, she spoke freely, convinced the room held no awareness. She mentioned timing, planning, on relief that nothing could contradict her. The small device beside the bed captured every word clearly. Cynthia stayed still through the entire visit, knowing proof mattered more than confrontation. For the first time since the accident, control had begun shifting back toward her. Late that night, Laura asked David to step into a quiet consultation room. Her voice remained calm but serious as she played the recording. At first he didn't understand what he was hearing. Then Nellie's voice became unmistakable, detailed, confident, undeniable. Each sentence drained the color from his face as realization replaced disbelief. He listened to the entire recording without speaking. When it ended, the silence stretched heavy between them. The accident was no longer random. His affair was no longer a private mistake. Someone he trusted had deliberately caused the harm now surrounding his life. David sat down slowly, hands shaking, replaying every conversation he had defended in his mind. Laura told him Cynthia was aware but pretending to remain unconscious for safety. The knowledge struck deeper than the confession itself. He had nearly mourned a woman who was fighting alone while he stood beside the person responsible. For the first time, clarity replaced confusion, and his next decisions would no longer be guided by doubt. The hospital conference room filled quietly the next afternoon. A hospital administrator, a police officer, David, and Nellie stood under neutral lighting that made every expression clear. Nellie appeared confident, believing she was present only for paperwork discussions about Cynthia's condition. She even offered polite sympathy toward David, carefully maintaining her composed concern. Then the officer placed the recorder on the table and pressed play. Her own voice filled the room, calm, deliberate, unmistakable. The confidence left her face almost instantly. She tried to interrupt, claiming misunderstanding, but the recording continued with details too precise to deny. Each word removed another possible excuse until silence replaced resistance. The door opened, and Cynthia entered slowly with support from a nurse. Pale but steady, she stood upright. Nellie stared in disbelief, her certainty collapsing into panic. The officer stepped forward and calmly informed her she would need to answer formal questions. For the first time since the accident, Cynthia and David stood on the same side of truth, though not of the past. Weeks passed after the investigation began. The house by the lake felt different when Cynthia returned, not because of memories, but because she now saw it clearly. She packed only what she personally chose, sketches, notebooks, and a few quiet photographs. David watched silently, understanding some things could not be repaired simply by regret. They spoke once on the porch facing the water. He apologized without defense. She accepted the words without restoring the relationship. Trust, she explained gently, cannot survive replacement. Healing for her required distance, not anger. When she left, it was not rushed like before, it was certain. Months later, Cynthia opened a small design studio in a new city, working openly and confidently. The calm she once protected now belonged entirely to her. One evening she closed the office windows and looked at the sunset across unfamiliar streets. The past no longer followed her. What began in betrayal ended in independence, and this time her peace depended on no one else. As this story comes to an end, remember that behind every luxury lies a truth few ever see. If this story moved you, support the channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Until the next unforgettable true story, stay inspired and stay curious.